Good morning to all listeners in Europe and good afternoon to all listeners in Asia. And a special thanks and welcome to our speakers. So I welcome you all to this webinar organized by EVBN about the construction and real estate sectors in Vietnam. My name is Safo Brian. I'm the Deputy Director of the EVBN and I will be hosting today's session. So first, I want to briefly talk about EVBN. We are the EU-Vietnam Business Network, which is the organizing project of today's webinar. And we are an EU co-funded project that was launched at the end of 2013. And the objective of the project is to strengthen the EU business sector in Vietnam, in particular by supporting European SMEs with an interest in the Vietnamese and/or the ASEAN market. So while EVBN is present in Vietnam, we also work with a network of European business associations in ASEAN to widen business opportunities for European companies. Next slide. Okay. So now let's have a quick look at our agenda for today's webinar. So we'll kick off our webinar with an overview of the characteristics of the Vietnamese construction sector, which will be presented by Mr. David Martin, who is the Group Director of Business Development at Archetype. Right after, Mrs. Zoom, who is the Senior Director, Head of Valuation, Research and Consulting at CBRE, will give us an overview of the real estate sector in Vietnam and will tell us more about trends in Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh and other provincial cities by also presenting us key drivers in the sector. We'll then follow the presentation with Mr. Maxwell Brown, Business Intelligence Manager at Desanshira, who will explain about the construction and real estate taxes, as well as the regulators and regulations to be aware about when investing in the sector. Thereafter, a Q&A session will round off the agenda, so please feel free to send us your questions in advance via the chat of this webinar platform. I will be administering your questions, and today's speakers will attempt to answer all of your questions during the 30 minutes time frame dedicated to Q&A. Therefore, some of your questions may be summed up into one single question so as to allow a maximum of questions to be answered. Next slide. So this is today's agenda. Okay, and now a brief introduction about our sectorial market reports. So we regularly publish market reports, which are all accessible for free on our website. And so the 4 market reports which you can see on the first slide, and which are circled in red, are the latest market reports. So there was one about e-commerce in 2018, another one about the hospitality sector, about the education sector, and about distribution and retail channels in Vietnam. And right now we are also having another one published about the construction and the real estate sector, and it will be available on the 12th of October. So stay tuned and you will be able to download it on our website very soon. So I will now give the floor to Mr. David Martin, who is going to start his presentation by giving an overview of the Vietnamese construction sector.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I don't know from where you are listening to me. Thank you for being here, listening to us. I have a limited time to give you an overview of the construction, so let's call it just a quick overview. Later on, if you need more data, I will be happy to provide it. And we're going to start with some figures. This chart you can see on your screen now is the evolution of GDP coming from construction in the last years. Well, it tells us that in 2018 we are going to do some 9.35, 9.4 billion US dollars, and that the evolution seems to have slowed down slightly in 2018. Later on we will see more. These 9.35 billion are around 4% of the GDP of Vietnam, which is slightly below the benchmark of the region. This chart talks more, and what it is saying or shouting is that infrastructure, which is the gray part of a pie, is not taking enough weight in the total construction market. This behind this, it's just a lack of funds, basically. But with the current needs of infrastructures of Vietnam, this to be at the level of similar countries in the region should be around 60-65% of the total volume of construction. And this explains partially what we're going to see now, which is this chart on the bottom right. In here we have compared the volume of construction in 2017 in Vietnam with those of some neighboring countries. We have to explain some details. The first one is that while in Indonesia and Malaysia we have taken out the figures corresponding to oil and gas construction, we cannot really eliminate all those where the oil and gas is still the main driver. Think of a port, for example, in Surabaya, Indonesia. Maybe 80% of its business is oil and gas, and it wouldn't be there if it was not for the oil and gas. But it still counts as non-oil and gas infrastructure. So Malaysian and Indonesian figures may be slightly high to make this comparison. And in Thailand and Philippines, we are currently immersed in this policy of build, 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 as Mr. Duterte says, that is very aggressive in terms of investment in infrastructure. We have power plants, we have rail, we have ports, we have highways in these Thailand and Philippines figures. So what do the experts say about the evolution? Well, we have done two different charts. You see one on the left and one on the right that indicate the one on the left is a very short-term forecast, and it includes the buildings and real estate, while the one on the right does not include the building and real estate, and also is not on construction but on investment. So if we go to the one on the left, we see that especially for 2020, there is an important forecast of growth. And apart from the infrastructure, this is also sustained by a massive need of affordable, not social, affordable housing that is starting being supplied bit by bit in Vietnam, and is going to take an important role in the next years. And on the right, as I told you before, we have an evolution of the forecast of demand and investment in infrastructure. Between 2020 and 2040, just to take an example, we see almost 70% increase. This you see now is a picture taken from my house, and I believe it's going to be very useful for you to understand the landscape of the construction and the evolution in the last years. It will help you understand the other two slides that come afterwards. This tiny block that you're looking at right now, highlighted in white, was until 2010 the tallest building in Saigon. So you can have an idea of the evolution in the last 8 years in this city. This one towards the left, was by its handover in 2010, not in 2010, the tallest residential building in the city. Then we have Saigon 1 building, which is, to my knowledge, the last large building done by a European Union company in full EPC model, before it was wiped out by mainly the local contractors. And then we see some examples of the heavy infrastructure, or important infrastructure that is happening also in the city. You see there is where the footings of the 2TM Bridge 2 have been done. We see also the node at the end of 2TM1 bridge, which has underpass, overpass, and some sophisticated infrastructure. And we see the line 1 of the metro. Out of most of these projects, there is one common player, and that player is Bachy-Soletanche, that belongs to Bansi Group, and that is specialized in deep foundations. Let's remember that of high specialization, because in order to find a place for ourselves, we're going to need to be highly specialized. I have made a quick sort of the local construction, because the local contractors are very important to us if we want to enter this market. As we saw in the picture before, now it's easy to understand that they are increasing dramatically their skills. But in terms of quality and HSE, they are not yet there. They also struggle with some sophisticated structures of contracts, like the PPT or the BOT. And it's very difficult for them and for most players to find the qualified labor force. Opportunities, we have seen them in the charts. All the affordable housings and the ambitious investment in infrastructure is there. And among the threats, we have to pay special attention to the FDI guided investment. The FDI projects normally bring along the consultants, the contractors, the procurement, and that is something that at the same time that is a threat for the local contractors can be a vehicle that we can use to enter the market. Then what the volatile real estate is one of the factors, claims, disputes, there are several other threats. So to conclude, if we want to know what is for us as foreign entities, EU entities, to enter in this market, I have divided it into two. On the left, specialized service, remember the Bachy-Soletanche comment, data centers, IT, smart city, definitely on a longer run, the high speed rail, and of course industrial production equipment, power generation. On the high end of the hospitality and the residential, we can have still some procurement of construction material well received from Europe, and definitely the self-finance projects. You bring the money, you have a lot of likelihood to get the project. So if your company can bring the funds, or if you can convince your government to fund the project, you can be nominated. And this is all on my slot. I hope it's been informative.
Thank you very much for such an interesting presentation, Mr. Martin. Let's now hear from Mrs. Zhu to learn more about the real estate sector in Vietnam.
Hi everyone, and thanks David for very comprehensive comments on the Vietnam construction market. Actually, we have the real estate market as busy as the construction market over the last few years. Again, due to the time limit that are given to us, allow me to just focus on the Vietnam condominium market. As you will see here, Vietnam real estate market does cover a wide range of sectors, including commercial and condominium, of which condominium is the most sought after sectors. So allow me to just focus on condominium market for the next 1 hour talking about the property market. My presentation will be divided into 3 main parts. The first part will be about the overview of the Vietnam condominium market. The second part, I will discuss on the key demand drivers that are driving the condominium demand for the 2 major cities, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh. And the last part is about our best guess and our forecast for the next 3 years. Now, let's have a look at the Vietnam condominium market over the last 10 years. You will see on the chart, we have put down here the number of new supply by year from 2007 to date. And you will see that over the last 3 years, the Vietnam property market had witnessed a very strong recovery in terms of new supply. So the chart on the top show you how many number of newly launched units per year. In 2015, both city Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh each welcome around 35 to 40,000 newly apartment for each year. So over the last 3 years, 2015, 16, and 17, the market welcomed in combination of close to 200,000 units, which is significantly higher than the accumulated number over the last 10 years. The recovery of the property market in Vietnam have been hugely supported by the low inflation rate and low lending rate that we have witnessed over the last 3 years, as you can see from the chart in the bottom. The average CPI has been very stable since 2014, with an average of from 6 to 7%. The lending rate has also been decreased from as high as 14% in 2011 to only 7 to 8% in 2017 and around 8% to 9% in 2018. Another significant highlight of the property market in Vietnam, especially the condominium market in Vietnam, is not only the significant increase in supply, but also the expansion of the mid-end segment. On your left-hand side chart, you will see the expansion of the mid-end segment. Right in 2007, the mid-end segment, the mid-end condominium accounted for only 34% of total supply. As of today, the mid-end segment accounted for 64% of total supply. This reflects the major demand on the market. For your information, mid-end segment are the products that are selling from $800 to $1,500 per square meter. Again, this is where a majority of demand from our population in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh asks for. So this bring about a more balanced and more sustainable market to the real estate market in Vietnam. In terms of absorption rate, we also have witnessed a very healthy absorption rate over the last 3 years. So even though we have a very huge supply in 15, 16, and 17, but we also witness an high absorption rate. On average, each year the market consumes around 70,000 units on average, bringing about 90% of absorption rate. So the market is very healthy in terms of low inventory, high number of units that has been successfully transacted. In terms of pricing, a positive highlight here is that even though we've seen a number of new supply, especially in so well-located areas like District 2, District 1, and District 7, but the selling price has been very stable over the last 10 years. Except for the luxury segment that we may see an increase of like 8% year on year, but for all other segments, affordable, mid-end, and high-end segment, the selling price has been very stable, and we only see a fluctuation of just 1% or 2% year on year. In terms of key players on the market, same as the construction market, the real estate market has been dominated heavily by local developers. You will see on the pie chart here that in 2015, 93% of our developments are developed by local developers. Only 7% are developed by foreign developers. But the picture is changing gradually today when we see more participation from foreign developers. And you also see not only the expansion of big groups like Capital Land, Keppel Land, or Maple Tree, but you also see first-time investors coming to Vietnam from Japan, from South Korea, and even from mainland China or from America. In terms of buyer profile, again, 99% of our buyers are local, but since the market is more open to foreign buyers in 2015, we started to see more and more foreign buyers, as you can see in the next chart. According to the transaction number by CBRE in 2017, only 36% of our transactions are made to local buyers. The rest are sold to Singaporean, Korean, Taiwanese, and Chinese. So we see more and more foreign buyers interested into the property market in Vietnam. The last slide in this part is explaining why real estate market is emerging that strongly in Vietnam in these recent years. Property is already one of the main investment channels in Vietnam. This is the most preferred. Now, when we compare real estate market with other investment channels like stock market, gold, exchange rate, or bank deposit, it looks like that when you invest into a high-end condominium in Ho Chi Minh, the rate of return seems to be the highest, which is around 8 to 9% per year. Only slightly below stock market, but again, when you invest into a stock market, it doesn't guarantee you a very stable rate of return. So investing into the property market seems the most preferable way for most of the local people. So that is the last slide of the market general overview. Now let me come to the second part that discusses on the demand drivers. Why real estate market is still developing that strongly in Vietnam. Again, with a population of 92 million people, and especially in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh, we see highest growth rate of population and urbanization. Not only with the growth rate of population and urbanization, we also see very high growth rate of GDP per capita in Hanoi and in Ho Chi Minh. This all support for the strong demand for the housing market. One significant driver is the mortgage market. We all know that in Vietnam right now, most of buyers are still buying on cash. Let's say around 80 to 90% of our home buyers are still buying on cash because the mortgage market in Vietnam is not very favorable to local buyers. And with the even though the lending rate in Vietnam has been reduced significantly over the last few years, but with 8 to 9% of lending rate, still considered very high compared to other neighboring cities. the market still seem to be very unfavorable. But moving forward, we understand from a number of commercial banks that the mortgage market would be, the home loan market would be given more priority from the commercial joint stock banks, and that would give a lot of more reason for home buyers to increase the demand. We have mentioned about the very attractive rental yield when you invest into the condominium market in Vietnam. You can get up to 8% if you invest into a condominium market. And why foreign buyers are also interested into this market? Because compared to other neighboring cities like Singapore, Bangkok, or Manila, it is even more attractive. In Singapore, you could only get 2 to 3% of guarantee yield. Not to mention that in terms of selling price, Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh still proved to have much more attractive selling price of high-end and luxury condominium. One of the major demand driving factors that we consider, especially for the developing market like Vietnam, is infrastructure. The problem is that we haven't got a very effective public transportation system. We haven't got yet the metro system. We haven't got yet the rapid bus transportation system. And the government, being aware of so high demand for the transportation system, the government has made a lot of effort in spending millions of dollars into infrastructure system. So we believe that only behind China, Vietnam is now emerging as a country of spending most of the funding into infrastructure. One of the major infrastructures that have been on discussion recently is the Metro Line number 1 in Ho Chi Minh City. We believe it would be a huge demand driver for the property market in Ho Chi Minh once it is completed in the next 3 years. Even though the metro line is still under construction, we have seen over the last 3 years a number of condominium projects and commercial projects have been built on both sides of the metro lines. So those are the key demand driving factors for the condominium market in Vietnam. And generally speaking, we think that in the developing market like in Vietnam, there are still a huge potential for property market to continue to develop. Now, what would be our forecast and our outlook for the next 3 years? Even though we have the last 3 years with so much new supply, a lot of people are wondering whether or not the market can absorb such huge supply. But we still think that the market is still in a very healthy status. It will continue to welcome a huge number of new floods of supply in the next 3 years. As you see on the chart, for both Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh, 2018 until 2020, each year the market will welcome approximately 40,000 units, newly units, which is equal to the last 3 years. And in terms of sold unit, we also believe that the market still continue to absorb a similar number like what we have seen in the last 3 years. So generally speaking, we are still very positive about both new supply and both absorption rate. Selling price continue to be stable except for the luxury segment. So in Ho Chi Minh for a long time we haven't got many luxury products. Most of the products we've seen in Ho Chi Minh are just like low to high end, mid end. But we forecast that in the immediate 1 to 2 years, the market will welcome for the first time some very luxury projects that could be sold from $7,000 to up to $10,000 per square meter. So projects that we put here on the slide are just few out of several projects that we are aware in District 1 and in Thủ Thiêm area that could be sold at around $10,000 per square meter. Thủ Thiêm would be a significant story in the future. We have talked about this area for quite a long time, but it only been active over the last 3 years. And as you've seen the progress over the last 10 years, we take picture from the same angle. Actually, this picture taken from our office, and you will see very clearly how the area is changing with a number of projects have been constructed. We also will see a number of new townships to be constructed. For the last few years, most of the construction, most of the developments that we've seen is just a single-use development, small to medium size. But in the next 3 to 5 years, we will start to see many new mixed-use and township developments, and that will reshape the picture of Saigon. Nevertheless, we need to be aware of the increase in the land price in Ho Chi Minh. Only over the last 2 years, we have seen the land price increasing by 100%. For some certain reason, it could be increased by 200%. This season, this will continue to happen over the next 3 years, given that the land bank in Ho Chi Minh is becoming more and more limited. We also have some warning about the oversupply of the market, even though we are still positive about the market future. But for buy-to-let investors, please be aware that the market is to a certain extent oversupplied. For some certain area, you could get a guarantee in or written in of 8 to 9%. But for some other area where there are too much supply, the written in could be as low as only 4 to 5%. So competition would be much fiercer when more and more supply coming to the market. Now, last but not least, challenges are still there. There are certain things that we cannot improve overnight. Traffic congestions, flooding, and delay infrastructure are all challenges that we think continue to be the main threat for both investors and both buyers in Vietnam. The last slide is about market cycle and history. We have gone successfully through the last cycle. With the last 3 years, we have seen a very strong recovery. A lot of doubts on whether or not the market cycle will continue to last for the next 3 years. Some are so worried about the possible downturn of the market when we enter 2018. But the reality has shown that 2018 continued to be a very strong year, not only for condominium market, but also for commercial market. So we continue to believe that at least in the next 2 and 3 years, the market will continue to grow positively. So that brings my presentation to the end, and we are open to any questions later on. Thank you.
This was very interesting. Thank you very much for sharing your insight about the real estate sector in Vietnam with us today, Mrs. Dung. Let's now hear about Mr. Braun for more explanations about the taxes and regulations that relate to the construction and real estate sectors in Vietnam.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today and for tuning in, whether it's late in the morning or early in the evening. I think what I would like to do during my time is to touch a little bit on some of the things that have been providing a catalyst for the growth in real estate and construction in Vietnam over the past decade. Unlike the two of my colleagues that I'm talking with today, I'm involved with the company that helps companies that are investing in Vietnam to understand their exposure to taxation and to navigate Vietnam's regulatory environment. And while this might be a little bit mind-numbing at times, I think that I'm going to try to present it in a way that's going to be just a brief overview, just to give you guys an idea of what you're up against coming into Vietnam, and hopefully provide some brief assessment on how you would go about dealing with that. So I'm going to talk about the taxes in Vietnam currently, some tax incentives, key regulators that you should be aware of, the regulatory framework in Vietnam, and finally foreign investment and how the European Union Vietnam Free Trade Agreement can help you moving forward. So first of all, we've got an overview of taxation in Vietnam. These are kind of the basic taxes that you're going to have to deal with when investing in the country. There's corporate income tax, value-added tax, individual income tax, and import tariffs. Those are probably pretty familiar to most people. They're standard across a lot of different countries. And in general, Vietnam tends to have competitive taxation relative to other markets throughout Southeast Asia. For example, the corporate income tax compared to peers in ASEAN is one of the lowest. I think only Singapore comes a little bit lower at 17%, but compared to other markets like Indonesia or the Philippines, Vietnam's quite competitive. And on individual income tax as well, this is pretty competitive. It's not going to cause too much of an issue. Import tariffs, depending on the market, could be a challenge, but in general, Vietnam's trade agreement network helps to mitigate that in a lot of cases. I think the two taxes that might be new are the land registration tax, which is charged when a purchase is made of real estate, and also foreign contractor tax, which is applied to companies that are participating in construction projects that are being carried out by companies operating in Vietnam. So if you're providing a service to an ongoing construction project in a very technical area, this is something that you might want to deal with. So on the left-hand side, I'm just going to move something on my screen. On the right-hand side, I've outlined the three phases that I see tax exposure playing a role at the moment. There's the purchase of real estate, there's construction activities that are being carried out, and then there's the sale of real estate within the country. So I'm going to... Okay, so on the real estate purchase side, the major taxes that we're going to have to deal with here are VAT and land registration tax. Value-added tax is charged on top of whatever you're paying for the property, and then land registration tax is also charged as part of the transaction to register the property in Vietnam. So the value-added tax comes in three different tiers in Vietnam. It can be applied at a rate of 0%, 5%, or 10%. In the case of most real estate transactions that a foreign company is going to deal with, it's going to be applied at a rate of 10%, and there's very little opportunity to reduce that. So in this case, the VAT that you're going to have to pay is going to be paid to the party that you are purchasing the land from. And then land registration tax is also applied on top of the purchase price of the property. Then from the construction side, the major areas of tax exposure that most companies are going to face would be labor-based payments, corporate income tax, and then if you're sourcing components from abroad, then you're going to have to pay taxes on the importation of those products, depending on where they come from. On the labor side, social insurance is something that companies that are incorporated in hiring local people to carry out construction within Vietnam are going to have to pay attention to. This is done on a withholdings basis. You have to withhold tax from your employees, and you also have to make payments on their behalf for unemployment, social insurance, and issues regarding to injury at work. Then individual income tax, generally speaking, this is also withheld by the employer at the rates depending on the salary of the employee. And then finally is foreign contractor tax. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. This is something, if you're not incorporated in Vietnam, it's going to be applied to on the corporate income tax side and on the value-added tax side. Like I said before, corporate income tax is applied on profits and is generally provided a rate of 20%. There are incentives that I'll talk about in a little bit, and those are generally pretty competitive within the country. Foreign sourced inputs, this is something if you are importing components or very technical parts that you need as part of the construction process, depending on what those are, depending on the HS code of those goods and where it's coming from, this could be an issue. I think, fortunately, for countries from the European Union, if you're sourcing from your home country, these most HS codes and most tariffs that are currently placed on EU goods are going to be removed over the course of the next several years, depending on the good in question. All right, so now on to foreign contractor tax. So foreign contractors are foreign companies that are operating in partnership with a local enterprise in order to carry out construction within the country. They're not established as a legal entity within the country, and so, without this kind of a regulation, there would be a very difficult. It would be difficult for the Vietnamese government to tax those transactions and that work that's being carried out. But as my colleagues mentioned in their previous presentations, there are certain areas where foreign contracting plays a pretty important role in order to impart very technical skill sets and to assist with construction of big projects, particularly in the PPP sector. So I think there is definitely an opportunity here, but from a tax exposure perspective, people are going to have to pay attention. Most of these are going to be taxed at 5%. You can see that under number 4 down at the bottom. And then this is on the value-added tax side. Value-added tax for construction-related matters is also going to be at generally applied at a rate of 5%, depending on the value of services being provided. Okay, so finally, if you're selling property in Vietnam, then there's 2 elements that are important to take into consideration. There's the compliance aspect, and there's also the tax liability aspect. On the compliance side, companies are going to be required to collect VAT from the person that they're selling to. And then on the liability side, when you're selling real estate, you have to pay corporate income tax or individual income tax, depending on whether you're an individual or a corporation that's selling property within the country. Okay. Now on to tax incentives. So, it's lost. Oh no. It's okay. Testing 1, 2. It's good. All right. Sorry about that, guys. I think there was some connectivity issues here. If that happens again, please let us know. Maybe send a message in the comments or something, and we'll try to deal with it as quickly as possible. I'm not sure how much got knocked off of what I was talking about, but if there's any questions, please let us know, and we can deal with them in the Q&A session. So to wrap up taxation, there's a couple of tax incentives that I would like to just bring everyone's attention to. I think the most important, probably for a lot of companies that are considering doing infrastructure investment, would be in disadvantaged location investment incentives. These are done on obviously a location basis and are set up in order to incentivize companies to provide investment in areas of the country outside of major city centers where their investment would play a significant role in rising the socioeconomic conditions of people living there. The next one are for encouraged sectors. So there's not a whole lot that can be done in this side from a construction perspective. But as my colleague mentioned, there are certain social housing projects that would allow you to get tax incentives in that particular area. So this tax incentives usually apply to corporate income tax in Vietnam. So, and they can be split on a preferential rate. So for example, on the encouraged sectors tax incentive side, you would see tax slashed from 20% to 10%, and then there are additionally, saying that there's an audio issue again. Audio issue. It's okay. All right, I will continue then. So in addition to there being a preferential corporate income tax rate, you could also see corporate income tax exemption for up to 4 years, and then a reduction for up to 9 years after that. Okay. And then there's a little bit on the future outlook for taxation. So for property tax, there's been talk, a proposal by the Ministry of Finance in April for the imposition of a 0.4% tax on property owners with more than 30,000 in assets. This is pretty low, so a lot of foreign investors would likely be impacted by this should they be purchasing property. In general, in ASEAN, on the corporate income tax side, there's been a race to the bottom, so to speak, with corporate income tax rates. Over the past several years, Vietnam's reduced its corporate income tax rate, and there has been talk of reducing it to 17%. There are no clear indications that this is going to happen, but it's something to keep an mind and keep an eye on. And then finally, on the import tariff side, TPP and EVFTA are coming on the horizon, and they are definitely worth keeping an eye on and will end up reducing import tariffs on a lot of different goods. Okay, so now onto the regulatory side of things. I think this is perhaps one of the most important areas that can help to explain why there's been such an explosion of investment in Vietnam and in the infrastructure and real estate sector in general. In 2007, when Vietnam joined the World Trade Organization, a lot of regulations within the country were not set up in a way that was conducive to foreign investment. This is not the case anymore, and over the past decade, Vietnam has made some pretty significant strides in order to bring its regulatory standards up to par with the rest of the world. So I think from a foreign investment standpoint, there are a couple of different organizations within the government that are worth keeping an eye on. I think for foreign investment, the most important is the Ministry of Planning and Investment. They're in charge of regulating foreign investment within the country, and they're going to detail all the conditions that foreign investors are going to have to deal with when they're investing in the country. So if you're getting involved in construction, contracting, they're going to lay out the conditions or tell you which other organizations within the government are going to be responsible for dictating how you're supposed to operate within the country. Now, once you're within the country and involved in the construction industry, the Ministry of Construction plays a pretty significant role in managing construction projects. In a little bit, I'll outline the legislation that they've implemented in order to regulate construction within the country. And then when it comes to getting your land and understanding how land is treated within the country, the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Provincial People's Committee are both play important roles in the transactional side of real estate and also the administration of land within the country, dictating where certain things can go, basically zoning. Now, the legislative process, as I mentioned, Vietnam's legislation and legislative infrastructure is still in a large way under development. So for anyone who's investing in the country for the first time, I think this is an area to be cognizant of, and when new legislation comes onto the scene, it's important to note. So when Vietnamese laws are passed, they're passed in a law form, and usually a law in Vietnam would outline the major changes that are going to happen and then dictate and delegate ministries that are in charge of carrying out these competencies. So, and a lot of times when laws are passed, the changes that they make are not necessarily enforced immediately because the agencies in charge of enforcing them and the specific mechanisms in order that are going to be important during the implementation and enforcement process have not been outlined. After a law is passed, a decree comes in, and this is where a ministry is going to outline their plans of how they're going to implement this particular aspect of a law, and then circulars would clarify the plans for implementation and delegate from the ministerial level to departments what different departments within ministries are in charge of doing. This process can take a number of years to go through, and I think this can also help to explain that even when Vietnam joined the WTO, started passing laws to help bring their standards up to par with international best practice, that it still took a while for investment to kick off within the country. So these are Vietnam's basic regulations on construction, and I think this helps to provide an example of what I'm talking about. So at the very bottom, this law was passed in 2014, and there's been a number of decrees and circulars that have been issued that basically outline a comprehensive set of regulations for construction within the country. And it took about 3 years for this to be fully fleshed out. So this is detailing construction contracts, the planning of a construction site or an investment, quality management within construction projects, issuance of construction permits, and the liberalization of investment conditions within construction projects. So I think if you're involved in construction, these are all worth paying attention to and looking into. They're going to spell out exactly how you would go about executing construction projects within the country. But I think more importantly, I think this is a good example of how the legislative process works in Vietnam, and it also showcases how long it could take for something to come to fruition from a regulatory side. What are we doing on time? A little bit over. I think we can stop there and go to the investment side. Okay. So I don't want to take up too much of you guys' time. So I think we'll get to foreign investment and then EVFTA, and we can break for questions. From the foreign investment side, I think overall it's pretty permissive. I think the one thing to note for foreign investors is that Vietnam operates a land lease system rather than allowing companies to purchase land outright. So this is a cause for concern for a lot of people that come from countries where land purchase is permitted in a traditional sense, where you own it and you own it forever. In Vietnam, land use rights are allocated for periods of 50 years, and also capped on the duration of a company's business license. This can be renewed, but I think it's also important to point out that when a company has these land use rights, when they have purchased a property, so to speak, that sale of units, rental, and all the rights that come with that can be exercised within the country. So for all intents and purposes, companies should be able to exercise land ownership within the country. So this is for companies that are involved in construction. From a real estate perspective, there are also limitations on the number of units that people can purchase within the country. As my colleagues pointed out, there's a lot of foreign participation in purchasing condos and residential units within the country, and the Vietnamese government has imposed limits on the amount of units that foreign persons can purchase within a condo unit, a residential compound, and in an administrative ward. And this is not for an individual person. So, for example, a person is not capped at 30%. It's any foreign person adds to that 30%. Any foreign person adds to that 10% limit in compound units, and any foreign person adds to the 250 units in an administrative ward. So I think this is the major limitation that's currently placed in the real estate industry. For an individual investor, this is not going to be an issue. I mean, unless there is already a lot of foreigners in a particular condo unit or residential compound. But it is worth keeping in mind, and I think this has been an issue for people that we've dealt with in the past, where they've tried to lease, purchase, or get into a unit building, and they've not been able to do so. But other than that, purchase and is totally fine. Again, the duration of this is capped at 50 years, but once you have those land use rights, everything is totally fine. Now, from a foreign investment standpoint, in some of the technical services, I think, and in construction in general, there are a number of different business lines that the Vietnamese government outlines as conditional within the country. And these business lines, it's not an exhaustive list, can be faced with licensing, certifications, capital requirements, and even foreign ownership limitations. And so I think for foreign investors, particularly involved in construction services, should definitely take a look into how this would impact their operations in order to basically make sure that they can invest in the country and to comply with these any conditions that are placed on that sector. So finally, the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. This is kind of the talk of the town at the moment, so I'm going to kind of go over very briefly some of the basic questions that people have about the agreement itself. The first one being, what's the holdup? You know, obviously it was signed in 2016, and right at the beginning of 2016 gets finalized, and everyone starts getting excited that it's going to reduce tariffs on a lot of goods, and that investment opportunities for European companies are going to be amazing. And it's 2018, and we're still kind of waiting on that. I think the major holdup has been just procedural implementation of the agreement. There were some things that the Vietnamese government needed to comply with in order for the agreement to be implemented. The agreement needed to be translated. And from what I understand, and from what I've been seeing, this is nearing completion. So I would, in my estimation, think that over the next 6 to 8 months that we would see the agreement kick off and be implemented. I don't want to be too specific on a time frame just because we've seen this get dragged out in the past. But in general, I'm pretty optimistic that in the next half year that this would move forward. But I think more importantly for everyone who's listening here, people want to know how this is going to impact the construction sector. Now, there are a number of different elements of the EVFTA that I think would be important for companies involved in construction to understand. The first of these being probably least important, the importation of goods. Obviously, everyone knows this is going to reduce tariffs. You're going to have to figure that out on like a good-by-good basis, but it's pretty comprehensive. It's going to cover most goods. I think more importantly are specialized segments of the agreement that are dealing with procurement and dispute resolution. So I think one of the things that a lot of investors are concerned with are the capital-intensive nature of investment projects in the infrastructure sector. There's obviously a lot of potential there, but I think it's also pretty clear that foreign participation remains quite limited. I think because people are wary of the Vietnamese regulatory infrastructures and its ability to protect foreign investors. And the European Union has, bar none, some of the best investment protection, like international legislation out there, and this brings that to the table. The implementation of the investment protection section of EVFTA may take a little bit longer based on the ECJ's ruling on the EU-Singapore agreement. So that might take a little bit longer, but I think this will be very important for the construction sector. And also laying out a predictable framework for procurement is also something that construction companies can look forward to. And to tap into the benefits of the agreement, I think it will be important for EU companies to understand not only what the EVFTA says, but then how it's being implemented by various Vietnamese governmental agencies, and to figure out how they basically can apply for maybe tariff reduction through Vietnam, and how Vietnam's different government agencies are going to comply with the elements of the EVFTA that are speaking about procurement and how they can go about protecting their investments in the case of a dispute. Right. That finishes up.
Thank you very much, please, Mr. Brown. Your presentation was very interesting, and Vietnam clearly has a lot of potential. After all of these very valuable and interesting presentations made by our speakers today, we now have about 25 minutes left to look into some of the questions you have sent. So first of all, somebody asked if we could share the presentations with all participants today. So yes, the speakers have agreed about this, and we'll share the presentation a bit later in the day. Okay. Does anybody have any question? So if you have any question, you can write them in the chat. Okay, so we have one question for David. Can you please go into more details about the most promising niche European small and medium-sized enterprises can get involved in the construction sector? Is it rather technology-focused or knowledge-focused?
I would say that both of them, but the knowledge focused can be more prone to the individual's participation rather than the technology one. But both of them, if we go to highly specialized areas, as we mentioned, can be definitely acceptable. Okay. Consultancy is a knowledge-based, and then the procurement of any kind of equipment. So both of them, definitely.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have another question. I am a foreigner. After buying an apartment in a condominium, is there any taxes I need to pay if I decide to rent the apartment to someone else? This is a question.
Yes, you have. Alright, if you can give me your email address so that we can give you a more, because it's quite complicated. There is several requirement on tax if you rent out your apartment. But generally speaking, if your total income per year is less than 100 million dong, so the local currency, so you do not have to pay any tax. But then above that amount, there will be stepped tax. I am not quite sure on how much on that, so I will get back to you if you give me your email address, so we can send you a more detailed tax system.
Yep, sure. Thank you very much. Then another question. In your opinion, which areas in Vietnam are more likely to develop faster, other than Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh?
Apart from Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh, Da Nang right now is the third biggest city, especially for all coastal developments like hotel and resort, second home villas and condo towns. Da Nang, over the last 5 years, has emerged as having the fastest growth rate, thanks to a number of infrastructure, such as the international airport, international port, and it also has a very good connecting by road and train to all other big cities. So believe Da Nang as a central, other central cities that next to Da Nang would be the fastest growing areas in Vietnam.
Thank you very much. There was one question about the PPP. So maybe this is a question for Max. Regarding infrastructure investment, what do you think about the PPP latest decree?
I think that, in general, this is part of a continual trend to flesh out regulatory infrastructure in the country. I think that there may be further clarification needed on certain aspects of it, but overall, I think this helps to solidify a set of procedures that companies can follow when they're investing in the country.
Thank you very much. And pink book attribution to foreigners currently seem on hold. So do you have any feedback from the Ministry of Construction?
Not yet. This should come from the combination of Ministry of Construction and the Pinpoint Committee of the local cities. But we believe this is just a matter of time because the law already open to foreign buyers, and the law states very clearly that a foreign buyer can own a pink book. So there is no reason that foreign buyers cannot get it. However, paperwork is always much slower than we expect. Right now, that problem hasn't been settled yet by the local government, but we think it will be very soon.
Thank you very much. Then we have another question. We can bring precast technology know-how to the developers. These to cut construction time for about 70% and improve quality. So who is the contact in your environment to introduce this, to talk about this?
Well, maybe this one, I can talk about this one. This should be discussed with the contractors themselves and with the designers. Depending on which kind of owner you are talking to, they can be a target themselves if they are sophisticated enough. But the reality of Vietnam today is that unless you're talking about industrial construction, for the real estate, the developers are not very sophisticated. So to pass on your message, you should contact designers mainly, and structural designers especially, together with contractors.
Thank you very much, David. Then somebody is asking, what are the biggest risks to the real estate market, especially in terms of infrastructure?
Delay in infrastructure, because a lot of new developments are now built and developed based on the expectation of one or two infrastructure to be completed. But we have some painful lesson from the previous years that a lot of construction has been pended because of the pending infrastructure. And in the same time, a lot of developers have to get a loan from the bank, and why they cannot progress with the construction, but they still have to pay the bank loan. So that makes them really frustrating, and some already went bankrupt just because of the infrastructure delay. So I think that is the biggest risk in terms of infrastructure.
Thank you very much. Then somebody else was asking if we could share the camera with the participants, the camera of the speakers. Unfortunately, this is not possible, which is why we haven't done it. And regarding the person who wanted to get in touch with Mrs. Zhu from CBRE, we received the email address, so this will be communicated.
Yes.
Any other question from the participants? No? Seems like we've answered all the questions. So if there's no more question, then okay. So if there's no more question, then I should thank all speakers for such interesting and informative presentations, and thank you to all listeners for your attention. So this is the end of today's webinar about Vietnam's construction and real estate sectors. So we all remain at your disposal by email for any further questions. A short survey will be sent to all listeners within the next few days, which will help us improve our future events and services. So I therefore thank you very much in advance for your valued responses. And now I would like to wish you to have a great day ahead or a good evening ahead. And